And wow, I can't believe that I get to open this extraordinary moment where no sleep for 24 hours. We're going to attend all the sessions. We're going to take all the insights in. We're going to learn and we're going to share. I am Solitaire Townsend. I'm the co-founder of the change agency Futera, and it is my very, very great pleasure to be hosting this opening panel. And this is an august panel of incredibly insightful and knowledgeable individuals representing amazing organisations on the moment that we're living in. And I asked them beforehand to prepare some thoughts, and we're going to come to that in a moment. And I gave them the very deep, very insightful question of what the hell is going on? What is going on? What is this moment that we're experiencing? Is this a moment between the end of an exploitative and an extractive economy and a movement to a solutions economy? Is this a breakdown, a collapse, which there is some academic thought that's being done on? Is this a resurgence and a rebirth in a moment? And particularly understanding the turmoil and the upset and the horror that's being faced by so many around the world, as represented so well by Mariana earlier. So I'm going to come to each of our panelists. I'm going to ask them to briefly introduce themselves, and they've got 5 minutes to answer that question of what the hell is going on, because then we want to come to questions and insights from you. The community have joined us today. There's one thing I've learned over 21 years of working in sustainability, is that the sustainability community is vocal. So I'm expecting chat. Get in there and give me your chat. I'm expecting questions. Get in there and give me my questions. If there's not like a whole set of questions I don't get a chance to get to in terms of time, I'll be disappointed, because we're all stepping up here. Please, over this next 24 hours, don't be in receive mode. Don't just listen. Don't just take. Please be in gift mode. Gift your ideas, gift your questions, gift your insight, give us your insight in the chat. So, and I'm asking Chris to keep an eye on that for me. And if I'm not getting chat and questions, then I get to moderate you, the people in the audience, as well as moderating our speakers. So I'm gonna start out by asking John Elkington, who needs very little introduction, but one of the founders of the movement of which we're all a part, and of course the founder, and I love his job title, Chief Pollinator. I'm Chief Solutionist, and I might have to take Chief Pollinator as my other job title, because that's fantastic, of Valance. So John, what the hell is going on?
Sully, well, firstly, thank you for holding the reins on this, and thank you to Chris and GlobeScan and CSR Ukraine and CSR Europe for making this happen. I think it's timely. It's a privilege to be involved in all of this. And anyone who professes to know where all of this is going to take us over the next 3 to 5 years, I think is slightly delusional. But about 4 or 5 years ago, I started to talk about a U-bend, a period in our collective history where an old order does start to come apart. And you keep thinking, oh, it's going to stop here and it get back to normal. It's going to stop here and get back to normal. And I don't think that's remotely the case. I think the pace of disruption and unraveling, in a way, is going to accelerate. And my own personal sense is that this will take 10 to 15 years to clear. So this isn't something that's going to be done and then we'll all be sort of back home free. I think the pandemic was the first real warning of the fact that there are system dysfunctions that we've been ignoring for too long. And that's partly our governments critically, but it's also our whole sort of sustainability sector. I mean, we are so fragmented across so many different issues. It's extremely difficult at times to see where the really big stories are building and what we might collectively do to solve some of those. And then we had the war, and in a sense, that didn't come out of the blue either, in the sense that it, 8 years of conflict with Putin sort of moving into the Crimea and so on. The signals were all there. I want to just conclude by talking about the corporate side of this, because in some ways we've seen corporate action on a scale that would have been impossible to imagine maybe 3 or 4 years ago, where it wasn't just McDonald's, but huge numbers of multinational corporations, for all sorts of different reasons, some of them voluntary, some of them forced, decided to pull out of Russia, and very often sacrificing huge amounts of investment as they did so. That was corporate action on a scale that we hadn't seen before, but which we will need to see in other areas of some of the other challenges that we're talking about. But at exactly the same moment, when our agenda, our change agenda, whatever we call it, is mainstreaming, it's politicizing as well. And you only need to look at what's happened to Disney in Florida in recent weeks, just to see what happens when a CEO gets it wrong and makes a big social commitment supported by his employees and all the rest of it. But society decides that that's not the way that they want that particular corporation to go. So this is becoming more political. It's increasingly systemic. And I think we've all got to now step up and do things really quite differently. But critically, we've got to do it together wherever we possibly can. Solly, back to you.
Thank you so very much. And also thank you for keeping under your 5 minutes. This is a great start. I'm sure we'll already be having chat and questions coming through to John in this pivotal moment that we're in. But I want to go straight now to Dr. Ndidi Nolo Edozian, and who is the founder of the Growing Business Foundation and the Pioneer Group Chief Sustainability and Governance Officer at Danogate Group. So, Dr. Ndidi, from your perspective, is John right about the fact that we don't know where this is going, or do you have thoughts or even any prophecies for us about this moment in time that we're in?
Thanks very much. No, I think John is absolutely spot on. I think nobody knows where this is going, but perhaps I have an angle on it. And you know, the thread that I wanted to draw on is it's interesting. So our theme today is sustainability, and I totally agree with John that the level of corporate involvement and corporate action actually gives a lot of hope for the future. It's something I've always believed in. It's been 23 years of believing in that, and it feels great to actually be at that cusp of history. John, you might not remember, but the last time I met you was actually with Bertelsmann AG when we were doing the Reinhard Mohn Fellowship, which was all about corporate culture and the link between culture and sustainability. Now, here's the connect. You do. Here's the connect I want to make now. What we are suddenly all confronted with is this question: what is the value of peace? How do we value peace? And how do we actually what actions are required in order to sustain peace? Because you see, when we talk about sustainability, we talk about a number of things. We talk about, you know, data integrity. We talk about the need for transparency and in our reporting. We talk about comparability. Interestingly, and this is where the one part where I disagree with John about, well, we don't really know what's going on, is interestingly, financial data is backward looking. Sustainability data, which is part of the problem, has got to be forward looking. But I mean, how do you forward look and predict when peace is going to break down? Because if we all knew it, then our actions would have been different. So this is part of the reason why sustainability thinking is just so exciting. And it's something that concerns not just businesses, but actually every single individual and every single profession, including accountants and financiers that typically think that they're supposed to be only involved in the core financial function. But that's changing now. And obviously with all the regulations around the world kind of coming together and us trying to create a global baseline, that's really, really interesting too. And what's also interesting here, just looking at sustainability data and the forward lookingness of it and the unpredictability and nobody knows what the heck is going on bit, is that you have the black swan effect, in the sense that there could be triggers of innovation that come from the least expected sources. You have things like what's really growing now, at least on the African continent, is circular economy, because it brings together economic growth, operations, and environment in very pragmatic ways that actually roots itself in cultural antecedents and values and ethics. And I'll give an example of values and ethics. Trees. I mean, so I'm surrounded by trees at the moment, and at the moment they've numbered them, not very prettily. Maybe there's a more pretty way of doing that. Some of the trees are named, but over here, not too far from what my own village and culture believe, every human being actually has a sacred connection to a particular kind of tree. Now that's sacred, bringing alive that sacred connection between individuals and those trees creates an entirely different context to the environment, which is actually just as important as corporate action and corporate reporting and building in sustainability indicators into decision-making within organizations, simply because we bring to bear, and I will end where I started, the values and the ethics that allow us to bring into the room also those things that are not measurable, like peace.
Brilliant. Thank you so very much, Nadine. And it's wonderful to look out on your background of the trees, reminding us that they're there. I'm going to come to Georges Kell. Georges, you are the founder and the former executive director of the United Nations Global Compact. You know, Futerra is a signatory to this. I'm sure many of the businesses who are attending are the signatory. I think Nadine set us a good question. Do we know the value of peace? And is that something that has even been on the agenda, thinking about the value of peace for the corporate sector? And are we able to begin to have that conversation in the corporate sector quickly? Georges.
Yeah, thank you very much. First, I also want to thank Marina, Jan, and Chris for organizing this very timely gathering, taking stock and looking ahead. And I may come across now as a bit disruptive, but first, I totally agree that the pace of change is accelerating. Disruptions will increase. This is the new normal. It's systemic. It's not only power-driven, but also technology-wise and social norm changes. My take is actually, this is a brutal wake-up call. And I think the sustainability community needs a new narrative. We have been naive and we have been spoiled by history because most of us grew up in an era of stability and peace where rules and regulations and the idea of multilateralism gave predictability as a broader framework. Today, we are facing competing powers. The old empire thinking is not dead, it's still alive. The past, by the way, is never dead. It's always present in every respect. So we live in a new era where power trumps markets, full stop. And this is a brutally different outlook than the one within which we kind of cultivated the sustainability idea, created PRI, was my privilege, all sorts of sustainability platforms. So that is number one. And we don't have this new narrative yet. Just jumping on the bandwagon and saying divestment is good, I think is wrong. I take a little bit of an issue there. I think it's important to say that we are not at war with the Russian people. That would be wrong. I think this is Putin's regime that grossly violates the UN Charter, poses a dilemma for the UN, by the way, if one of the prominent members of the Security Council is grossly violating its own rules. It's a huge challenge. So I think coming to grips with power and politics is the most important challenge ahead. I had the privilege running business and peace initiatives around the world, but these initiatives were all focused on local civil wars, if you so want, in the Philippines, in Myanmar, and other places I remember. And business has basically a tendency wanting to have stability. And I always quote all sorts of historical examples where business leaders advocated for peace and not for war. But at the end, remember that the decision for war is made by those who hold power, and those who hold power usually are not really accountable. And this is a huge problem. And with the technological capabilities now, the destructiveness of war, which the people of Ukraine so bravely oppose, imagine you're being bombarded by artillery, brutally, indistinguishably. It's beyond imagination. So this is the new reality, and this is very sad. I think it's a reason to really go deep back into your own assumptions about the world. My recommendation is first we need to rediscover the values of peace and how to build and cultivate basic values of universal decency, respect, and rebuild that bottom up, if you so want. There's no other way around, because as I said, power is brutal. And by the way, there's no proper theory on power. Has been bothering me for 20 years. I tried with leading experts on foreign affairs to organize meetings to shake them up, arguing that, look, foreign policy people who do the thinking for those in power have no new frameworks. They still run on the old ideas of I have to be stronger than my potential enemy, or Stalin would say, kill your enemy before he kills you, and then you start killing everybody, really. So it's a basic human deficiency. We all have it with us, I believe. We all are weak. I do believe the enemy is us, inside us, and we have to start again. The sustainability movement needs updating urgently. I think we can no longer naively assume we are in safe zones. No, we are party to something. The notion of complicity, and the question is, how can business voices support peaceful I'm a strong defender still of engagement. I believe without commerce and trade, the world would be much worse off. But my basic message is we have to rediscover basic values of humanity.
Yeah, thank you so very much, George. And that point of the world has changed around us, and perhaps much like humanity evolved in the Holocene, and that is beginning to change. Perhaps sustainability evolved in the stable post-war era, and now that is beginning to change. Jane, what is the new narrative? What can answer this? Jane Nelson is founder and director of the Corporate Responsibility Initiative at Harvard Kennedy School, and has been watching this as our whole movement has evolved. Do we have a new narrative, or do we still have to search for one?
Thank you. Thanks very much, Sally, and also adding my thanks to Jan and Chris and Marina. And Marina, especially to you and your colleagues for just your incredible courage and resilience, and the strong reminder to all of us, as Georg was saying, of the incredible responsibility that each of us face individually as well as our institutions to stand up and speak out for human rights, people's fundamental rights, their dignity, for decency and justice. So thank you. And I think that has to be, Solly, to your question, the heart of the new narrative. I mean, as Antonio Guterres has said, I think very aptly, we all know we face the greatest cascade of crises in our lifetime. And I think part of the new narrative of sustainability, both for companies, but for governments, is, first of all, the new leadership imperative is simultaneously responding to and addressing shocks and crises, whilst at the same time recognizing the need to transform longer term our systems, both our economic systems, but particularly our energy systems, our food systems, political systems, financial systems, and health systems, and simultaneously managing and responding to crisis, and yet being part of a shift towards a long-term systems transformation, I think, is the leadership challenge we face. What's the narrative around that leadership challenge? I so much agree with Ndidi, Georg, and John in terms of what they've said, that they're going to be very challenging times, disruptive, whether it's sort of 10, 15 years. To me, in terms of what individuals and individual institutions can do, is three things, regardless of size or geography. And I'd sort of summarize them, maybe overly simplistically, around sort of respect, sort of innovate and invest, and then sort of advocate, particularly advocate collectively, and advocate beyond traditional types of advocacy. And I think on the respect agenda, this focus, and going back to the Brundtland Commission that Chris mentioned, of meeting the needs of the present without compromising the needs of future generations to meet their own needs. That put people at the heart of the sustainable development agenda, and I think we've shifted too much from that. And so that sort of fundamental respect for people's rights and dignity needs to come back to the heart of what we're doing. And that ranges from many more companies implementing the UN guiding principles through their core business to decent work, supporting living wage, supporting a just transition, not just the energy transition, but a just transition. But I think it also comes back to humanitarian response. And Georg, you've written recently, so much of the sustainability debate around companies has been around embedding in core business, and that's absolutely where it needs to be, and value chains. But also companies need to think, I think, more strategically about their humanitarian responsibilities, their support for civil society organizations, buildings, strong civic institutions, volunteering, etc. So that respect piece is crucial. I think that the sort of innovate and invest, there's so much, Georg, as you sort of started to touch on what we can do in scaling around technologies, both from an environmental perspective, but also sort of human rights perspective. But I think where the real innovation needs to be, and John, so much of the work you're doing around business model innovation, financing mechanism innovation, and sort of systems, ecosystem innovation, and thinking in a much more sort of systemic level around what we mean on innovation. And finally then on the advocacy agenda, John, as you pointed out, I think it's very challenging as these issues get politicized for individual CEOs to stand up, but they need to keep doing that despite the risks. But I think we have a real need and potential for collective action focused around, Marina, you said at the outset, this sort of SDG 16 around a peace, justice, and strong institutions advocacy agenda. We've had very effective advocacy with companies and others around the climate agenda, more and more around the human rights agenda. But I think collective action at a particularly at a national level, but also regional level, around the peace and justice and strong institution, rule of law agenda is going to be very important. So those are just sort of some initial thoughts to get us going. But I think that collective advocacy voice from business and civil society together, is where we really need to double down, and that needs to be a core part of the new narrative.
Thank you so much, Jane, and thank you for setting out what should businesses be doing right now. And we're having some questions come in on this, so I want to dig into this a little bit. So as you were speaking, it occurred to me, I don't think I've ever seen a corporate social responsibility report that reported on action on SDG 16. It doesn't tend to be an SDG that the corporate sector leans into or even considers itself to be relevant to. Perhaps that's something which we're going to begin to see change. But at this moment, at this transitional moment, pandemic, global strife, climate change, inequality, what is the step up? What is the next step up? So Jane's just set out a great three for us. And I think that final one around advocacy is so well made. John, is there, what, if you had one thing to ask of business to actually step up in this moment beyond what it's already doing, what would that be?
Well, I think it would be to pay attention to some of the language that is increasingly being used in this space. So, for example, for a long time, we've talked about responsibility and accountability and sustainability and all of these good things. And what we've heard in recent years is words like resilience coming through much more forcefully. And now it's hardening further. So we've got security, and we're talking energy security, we're talking food and water and climate security. And I would say to business, that's a symptom of the fact that things that were thought of as to one side of this core strategic purpose of a business are now slamming absolutely centrally into your risk and opportunity spaces. And you're going to have to think about this very differently, and you're going to have to put very different people into the process of working this through and thinking about the consequences for your particular business.
Yeah, thank you so very much. Nadia, I'm going to come to you and I'm going to ask you the same question. We're also getting a lot of questions coming in, Nadia, on the point that you made about trees and about our spiritual connection to trees, about offsetting, and whether one of the things which perhaps we're not discussing enough, I know some are, but not discussing enough, is the peace agenda and our natural world. and putting those two agendas together. So I'd love to hear some thoughts from you on that. I'm just going to hold for 1 second though and remind everybody who's listening and everyone who's online, you have to sign up to the Discuss app in order to be part of this. It's very straightforward. You just all the information is there, and you know it works because you can see people already asking questions. But if you've got questions or points you want to make, please sign up to the Discuss app. We are the opening session of this 24 hours. So these are the questions which are going to set the agenda for the rest of it. So get on that app and ask your questions. So Dr. Ndidi, what do businesses need to do to step up? And also, could you make some connections for us between the peace agenda and the nature agenda?
That's a ball nicely played in my direction, given that I'm Nigerian and I'm married into the south of Nigeria, which is what we know as the oil producing Niger Delta. And that's really a perfect example of, where lack of attention to nature, essentially eroding the natural environment and disregarding social justice, leads to a lack of peace. And actually not just leads to a lack of peace, leads to the kinds of risks that force businesses to stop doing business. And I have a very challenging question to ask in that regard, actually, because at the moment, the international oil companies who have actually been the proponents of a lot of these negative externalities are selling down their assets because indeed they are close to stranded assets. A lot of them can only operate offshore now and not onshore. And those are being bought now by indigenous companies. But the valuation of those assets does not incorporate, and this is the reason why I have always said that sustainability is not just about the present and the future, it's also about the past. Because if you're selling down that asset and you have decades of negative externalities that are not yet being costed because our costing isn't quite there yet, the value of those assets is not real. And what about the accountability of these companies? And this is where I agree completely with Georg, that divestment is not necessarily the path. So you divest, you drop the dirty assets and you carry on business elsewhere and go into renewables, okay. But, what does that mean? I think that's a big issue that we need to address. And in terms of connecting in another way, peace and nature, namely connected to these beautiful trees around me, I really am in an extremely rural area. I'm in the middle of nowhere, at one end of the world. And if I moved a little bit further down, I would see the sunrise and the sunset at the same time. And over here I stand, and I'm connected to the world, leveraging technology. And I'm watching how many different people create their livelihoods actually using traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, that there is so much to learn from. Actually, you see regenerative economies live, not because they've been reinvented, but just because they are, and they're embedded in the value system and the cultures of the people. And I really think that one of the things that needs to happen as part of this global sustainability movement, and it's what I stand for, that thing called culture, the ability to think globally, but also listen locally and ask ourselves, how do we customize this to the values and the ethics of the local peoples? And, how do we consider as well, not just big business? And it's funny because I was listening to something recently, and I'll stop here. And this is slightly technical, so let me not, but when we talk about emissions, and Chris said yesterday, and thank you, Chris, thank you, Jan, thank you, Marina, for organizing this. I'm the only one who hasn't said that. Chris said yesterday, keep it simple. When we talk about environment, we talk about scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. Now, scope 3 emissions are very murky, but where the large company scope 3 emissions end is where the small and medium scale company start. Scope 3 is where they actually meet. And that's the murkiest place of all, but that's also the biggest opportunity of all, because it's a way of building equity, inclusion, fairness, diversity, and real innovation. So I think that peace and nature, especially with corporates, especially with sustainability, because it is forward-looking and because it considers all of those factors that lead to the breakdown of peace, which are actually social, economic, and environmental. as long as those things are taken more into cognizance, then, I think corporates can be huge actors for positive change. And quite frankly, they see these things coming. And perhaps the very, very last point, sorry, is just to say that, look, there are many things that are actually considered part of the responsibility of government to preserve the public good. But when government isn't working, or when it is a little bit undemocratic, and sometimes democracy is expensive to manage, then corporates actually need to wield some of that power to lean on them, not just for policy changes for business, but for policy changes that enable and sustain peace.
Brilliant. Thank you so very much. And I think we're going to dig a little bit more into some of those policy changes as well. But Garrett, let's come to you in terms of the point that you made about divestment. And we've had a lot of questions on this. And in fact, Ndidi just built on it as well. So people saying, well, if it's not divestment, what do we do? What is the most powerful thing that we as businesses can do if we don't divest from the worst? And you're on mute.
It's a very hard question, and I agree with everything that has been said, but I still maintain we need a new forward-looking narrative that creates hope again, and that connects and that crosses political divides and connects local with local and so forth. And we thought we had it at some point after the end of World War II, when the great majority of the people on this globe agreed that peace is the foundation for economic growth, trade and investment, are means to expand opportunities. We are now at a real turning point where power is back and fragmentation is here. And business is between a rock and a hard place. Think about China and the emerging new Cold War and the new hate pictures that are being generated on both sides. It's really worrisome. I've lived through the Cold War. So I think three things business can do. One is collectively create a forward-looking story that shows how the world can live together in peace and spread opportunities with a strong commitment on the values we talked about. That is certainly one way. We don't have this narrative yet, but we need it. And that speaks to the issue of deglobalization, investment, trade, really the hard issues as well, but also the soft issues. All our narratives are based on the old paradigm, which no longer is valid. Secondly, within its operation, a lot of corporates are actually agents of peace. I really believe Chamber of Commerce was created in 1919, and they call themselves ambassadors of peace. After the war and destruction, they created hope and opportunity and employment. We have to go back to these basics and show how at the workplace, different cultures share the same purpose. And there are plenty of examples. I happen to work with Volkswagen these days more closely, and what they're doing in Ukraine and in Russia, I really admire it. I think it's one way to go. You use the workplace to cross divides, to have purpose, to be strong on humanitarian work, and go back to principles. And then it's the more tricky issue in areas where there is actually conflict already ongoing. We have done some studies some years ago showing how at the workplace, you can actually create a new culture, a culture of peace. And this culture of peace needs to be rediscovered in line with what Jane said. Peace, without peace, no development. Without development, no peace. And without ecological balance, no peace either. So we live now in this triad of fundamentals: peace, ecology, and economics. And we have to reinvent that again. And business, in principle, is a great force for that. Of course, we know that business is a very wide spectrum. And we talk about the transformation and how to accelerate it. That goes without saying. Technology helps, I claim. I think what Ndidi said is very true. My own firm, Arabesque, just put on the market a whole new platform that crosses all divides and cultures. I think that's one hope. But by itself, it won't be sufficient because you need the political will behind it to create stability. Business track record, I have to add just a little bit from a historical angle, is not very good in countering power. For example, the country where I happened to be born, Germany, when Kaiser Wilhelm, that idiot, went to war, World War I, the industrial groups lobbied against war, saying this is not good for us, war. But the idiot wouldn't listen. And I could give you 20 other examples of idiots around the world who chose power over benefits for people. So we have a real issue there with power.
Brilliant.
Okay.
Thank you. And actually, there's been a lot of comments about power, but we've had a really provocative comment. I think it's one that, but I'd like to come to both Jane and to John with, because I know it's something you've grappled with, is that, of course, we opened all of this and all the conversation, all the language we've been using is about sustainability. And the question that has been put very forthfully is like, why do we want to sustain this? Why do we want to sustain this system, this capitalist system where we've got sort of Elon, Jeff and Bill at all with this huge income disparity able to sort of blast them off to space? Is our language working against us by saying this is a situation that we want to sustain? And also the other point about sustainability is it implies that this is the end state, that we need to just sustain this situation that we're in rather than there being some sort of progress. And I have to say, the language of developed countries and developing countries, as well as being hugely inequitable as a language, also, I think it sucks to be in a developed country. That like implies that this is it. I live in the apotheosis of the human condition. There is nowhere to go from here. So, you know, should we be using this end state language? And I'm going to come to Jane first, or should we be thinking about rather than sustain, but to transform?
Yeah, I think, Solly, you've captured it. I think we need to shift the language, you know, to transform, regenerative, resilience. First point. Secondly, I think we need to get so much better at, as Gail described, that having an integrated conversation around, you know, sort of peace, human rights, you know, ecology and economy. And again, those were actually, you know, the three pillars of the original Earth Summit. But I think we've sort of just lost track of that
Exactly.
you know, human rights element. So I think that would be my immediate answer on the narrative. And I think I think we do need to start shifting words, and transformation and systems transformation is, you know, more and more what we should be talking about. And then the question, you know, what can an individual company do? What can industry sectors do? What can collective action do? What's the role of government in that agenda, you know, as well as business and civil society? So that's on the narrative front. And then very quickly on the step up piece, I just want to pick up on something that Ndidi sort of said about much more inclusive models. And I mentioned that we need to sort of transform business models. I think we also need to fundamentally transform governance models, and both the way we think about governance not just being about a board of directors, but governance being about sort of really strategic engagement with you know, key stakeholders and, you know, affected communities, and how do they, you know, how do workers, how do communities, how do you know, business partners have more of a say in the way that, you know, companies engaged and are governed. And I think, you know, that is, you know, part of the process that's needed to deal with some of the legacy issues, as well as, you know, look forward to a, you know, more regenerative future.
Thank you so much, Jane. John?
Well, it's a great question, firstly. And one thing that Jane and I share is fathers who were in the Air Force during the Second World War. And when you grow up with that sort of background, I can't speak for Jane, but I think you get a sense that peace is not a natural condition. Now, you can say that was the end of the British Empire period and so on, but it isn't a natural condition. Nature is not intrinsically peaceful, and it therefore has to be managed for. And I think one of the things that I would love to see is some sort of blurring of the boundaries between business schools on the one hand, where we're teaching the next generation of operators, managers, investors, and the rest of it, and war colleges or departments of defense, or the people are actually going to have to deal with some of the conflict-related consequences of what we've been doing over the last 50 plus years. And like Jane and others on this call, I've seen a real uptick in recent years in the defense industry leaning in and wanting to understand the climate emergency and the consequences for refugee flows and all the rest of it. I think there's work that needs to be done at that boundary in a way, and in a sense that requires us to assume that peace is not a God-given characteristic of the world in which we've been brought up. We're going to have to work very, very actively towards it.
Brilliant. Thank you so very much. We're in our last few minutes. And actually, we've had some questions from people who perhaps are not business leaders. This is an open session. We have not controlled who can join. We have not constrained it to a particular invite list. So we've had some people online who are asking questions as a citizen. So we've talked a lot perhaps about the need for policy change, the need for multilateral action. We've talked a lot about what businesses can do, because of course many of us who will be here for the 24 hours are experts on that. But citizens, individuals, people around the world, perhaps we could close coming to each of you with what recommendation would you give to those people listening who are not business leaders and are not entrepreneurs yet, but are citizens of countries around the world, and what they can do to help push forward this SDG 16. Gail, I'm going to come to you first.
Very important indeed, because societies are made up of people and culture is the aggregation of individual behavior. I always go back to universal principles of decency, respect. So many good efforts have been made already. We have to rediscover respecting others more. We have to rediscover the importance of making bridges and not destroying them. I'm a great supporter of engagement despite everything. It's the best hope we have. And yes, there's some basic behavioral things: truthfulness, honesty, living true to yourself. And so I don't want to drift off into other domains of ethics, but knowing what's right and wrong is the foundation of everything. Without a knowledge of what's right and wrong, and violence is bad in every form. Killing is no excuse under any form. Lying, we should stop it and call it out and not call it fake news, but a lie. A lie is a lie, and so forth. So we have to rediscover the basic wisdom of humanity, which actually I could give many quotes now or sources. I'm sure all of you are aware of it. And all of this was crystallized, by the way, in some of the United Nations Universal Principles, and is partly supported by governments, in principle at least. So we have a rich body of architecture where humanity has tried. We have to revive it.
Brilliant. I'm going to run through the others before we close. So Jane.
Yeah, I mean, building on that, I agree so much with what Georg has said, and then using your voices, whether it's at a local community level and volunteering, or through your votes, whether it's politically or in the marketplace, and activism for the common good, and collaboration for the common good that each of us can do at whatever wherever we are and wherever we operate.
Jane, thank you so very much. John.
One of the things I've often found myself saying is that our species tends to do its best work when it's backed into a corner. And we're now we've backed ourselves into the mother of all corners, if I can sort of use that phrase. And in those circumstances, I think it's absolutely crucial that every one of us maintains informed hope and spreads that to other people. And the final point I would make, don't underestimate how lonely and how painful being a change agent over many years can be, whether you're planting trees or fighting for human rights, or as we've just seen in Brazil with the 2 murders there. Say thank you to people that you see at close quarters doing the right thing. That means a lot to them, and see then how you can best help them.
I love that. Ndidi.
I just, first of all, thank you to all the panelists, and I agree with everything that was said. There's really nothing else to add. There are 2 thoughts that come to mind. One was, again, something that was said before, hope. It's really just important to hope in spite of everything. And, you know, that just speaks to attitude and mindset. We need to have that. The second thing that comes to mind is, interestingly, you know, the Club of Rome's first publication was Limits to Growth, which again speaks to the whole sustainability agenda a very, very long time ago. But its second publication that was really big was No Limits to Learning. No limits to learning. We're learning and we just have to learn together, and we've got to go, 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 go. And the last point was, I remember the second publication I ever made was titled, forget the second part, but the first part of it is Business is About People. Just to remember that actually we're all business leaders, whether we're running a household, whether we're employees and entrepreneurs within the business, whether we're running a tiny business, a small business, a medium or a large business, and we're all in this thing together. So that connection between peace and nature, sustainability and everything else, you know, just has got to be underscored. We're all in this. This is a time where everyone needs to be active, but most importantly, we've got to keep hope alive and keep asking the right questions, even if we don't have the answers. As long as we're asking the questions right, we're okay.
Brilliant. Thank you so very much to this panel. I wish that we were in a big room together so you could hear the roaring applause to Georg, to Jane, to John and to Nadidi. Thank you so very much. I'm here in Cannes in southern France at the big jamboree that the advertising industry has for itself every year. And I'm going to take that challenge of the narrative, because these are all the people who are paid to be the best storytellers in the world. And I'm going to challenge the community here with it. And I'm going to hand back over to Chris, and I'm going to learn from John's point about saying thank you. I'm going to thank you, Chris, Mariana, Jan, all of the team who are working on this. And I'm going to preemptively thank the next 23 hours of content that we're going to be gathering. And I hope there's a few people who stay for the whole thing and can say for the rest of their lives that they were there for the 24-hour webathon. Chris.
Thank you, Solly. And yes, we can in Cannes. Good for you. And you are the happy hero, and your great book, and all of you, Jane, John, Didi, and Georg, you're my heroes too. And that was a masterclass in exploring in a very short period of time the history of sustainability, where we are, understanding the moment, and driving forward. So thank you all very much.